Hey, everybody. Happy Monday. Hope your weekend was good. Mine was. Got to see my sister and brother in law and their kids in their new house and had a lot of fun. My brother's in town from Spain. So, for those of you who are unfamiliar with what I do every other week, usually on Mondays, um, I take questions from you all. I just have people super chat them, and it's partly just to make it easier to find them. Vanessa pulls them and puts them in a Google Doc for me. So if you've got any kind of questions, feel free. It doesn't have to be theology questions. It frequently is. Sometimes they're personal questions. Sometimes they're just whatever all over the place. Um, and then I just get them in order as they come in. Usually, occasionally there'll be something that catches my eye, and I do it out of order. I have 5 questions from last time, so I'm gonna get to those and then tackle your questions, but I'll just kinda go, I don't know, however long. I always go at least an hour. I often go a couple hours, but it just sort of depends. And occasionally I'll also grab questions that I happen to see. Like, I have the chat window open, but I can't always pay close attention to it because I'm looking at a couple different things. But I wanted to actually start off with one that, I the question was good, and the username added a whole other layer to it. And someone just asked this a moment ago. User at Deathwish says, "Why do you like true crime? I always thought of it as a bit of a perverse genre where you're entertained by the tragic last moments of another. What good have I missed about it?" So the first thing to say is, again, as I say, funny that someone named Deathwish should view it in that way. But there is that kind of true crime. I don't like that. There is a perverse kind, and the Truman Capote's book In True Blood is a great example of how not to do true crime. Like, that is just a delight in the suffering of another, where you know that this family is going to get murdered, and you just spend the entire book waiting to see them get murdered. Uh, and there's no whodunit kind of about it at all because you know these are the guys who did it, and so you're just waiting and kind of watching as everything kind of boils over. And that might work in fiction, but there's something really macabre and really uncharitable, frankly, about doing that to an actual family. Um, so I started reading that book many years ago. And then when I realized kind of what his gig was or what his kind of plan was, I was like, no, I don't want to read this. And since then, I've read other things confirming, like, yeah, that's exactly what the book is. The kind that I like is much more told from one of two perspectives. Because there's three types of true crime. There's the kind that glamorizes the killers or whatever the criminals. There's the kind that tells the victim stories, and there's the kind that focuses on the investigation. My wife really likes the kind that tells victim stories, and especially cases where there's like a survivor, and you get to see these kind of incredible stories of people who have been through some like really harrowing ordeal, and then they've overcome, and those can be really beautiful. I like the sort of mystery aspect of trying to figure out something horrible has happened here, and there is a way of solving this problem, and we just have to kind of think logically and work through. And that is something that really appeals to me, is like a real life problem solving. And I think this probably also explains why there are a lot of other seemingly unrelated things that I like that have nothing to do with true crime, but are just about like solving, could be like an engineering problem or like inventions and those kind of things. Something about that really appeals to me. So it's the kind where you're not rooting for the bad guys. You're rooting for the police, and you're thinking through like, okay, here's what we know so far. What can we kind of figure out from there? So there you go. Yeah, as I said, if you've got questions, please drop them in a super chat. If Vanessa, if you see any really good questions that aren't super chatted, feel free to pop those in too. That's fine, but no pressure because there's a lot of questions. All right, Justin. So these are the 5 from last time. Um, oh, okay. I saw another really. This is an easy one. Somebody said, "Joe, I just got accepted into law school. Am I cooked?" A little bit. For a while, it's going to feel that way. First year, they scare you to death. Second year, they work you to death. Third year, they bore you to death. So the first half of law school, you're going to be like, "What am I doing?" And just know that that is um, normal. and to just keep powering through. Do not take your foot off the gas pedal for the first 2 years. You can kind of take your foot off the gas pedal in year three if you've done a good job the first 2 years and you've, got a good job or something. But just assume you're going to have no social life and you're going to, everything else is going to be on the back burner and you're going to feel like a terrible friend and, terrible husband or boyfriend or whatever. I don't know your state in life. There's going to be a certain amount of that. It's like this with um, certain careers, we've got friends where the husband's a doctor and they always tell us how horrible it was going through like residency, and like the early years of a lot of professions are just these grueling trials by fire. And I wish it wasn't like that, but it is. So just power through that. Don't despair of it. And then you'll come out the other side. A lot of people who go through law school, like myself, don't end up becoming lawyers, but use the training in some other sense, but often it is still worthwhile. So there you go. Um, there was one other question that is super easy because I'm going to direct you to a video I've got coming out tomorrow. Somebody said, where was it? Sinnersary? I'm sure I'm not pronouncing that right. Says, why was the assumption of Mary made dogma? The question of why we should treat the Marian dogmas as dogmas, I answer in a broad way tomorrow. That still leaves a particular question of the assumption a little bit open, but I'm making the case in tomorrow's episode that we should take a different view of dogma than many people do today, where we think of dogma as like a burden of like, oh, why did we put this many burdens on people to believe? But then second, once you have a proper understanding of dogma, then it should make sense why Marian dogmas are our thing. If you still got questions after you watch tomorrow's video, I'd be happy to try to address them, maybe even do a follow-up. All right. As I said, 5 questions from last time before I get to this time's. We'll see how much it's before. Justin Beal says, could sorrow be in heaven for the saints? Because sorrow isn't sin and isn't opposed to the nature of God. The bit about sorrow in heaven is, first of all, I like that you pointed out that sorrow isn't sinful. Because that is something that a lot of people actually get wrong. Let me see here. All of the passions are passions. Like all of the passions are morally neutral. They are passive rather than active. Like they're not actions. They are passions. They're things that happen to us rather than things that we do in a certain sense, So there can be seemingly a kind of longing that the saints have. Let me see if I can find, there's a part in the Summa. Okay, here we go. St. Thomas on the nature of the passions in general says, love, joy, sorrow, and the like have a twofold signification. Sometimes they denote passions of the sensitive appetite, and thus they will not be in the separated soul, because in this way they're not exercised without a definite movement of the heart. In another way, they denote acts of the will, which is in the intellective part. And in this way, they will be in the separated soul, even as delight will be there without bodily movement, even as it is in God, namely insofar as it is a simple movement of the will. In this sense, the philosopher says that God's joy is one simple delight. That, in other words, sometimes when we're talking about the passions of the body, we mean something that is more like a biological thrill or a biological reaction, good or bad. You're on a roller coaster and you feel that kind of surge, or you have a jump scare and you have a fright, or you see something really beautiful and you're moved, but not even on a like rational level. That's a harder one to kind of see. You eat something really delicious and you have a natural delight in it at a pleasurable level, or something really disgusting and it disgusts you at a, again, like these are happening to you. So you can imagine a situation where somebody you love makes a meal for you and it's really just an incredible gesture, and you take a bite and it's like, ugh, that ingredient wasn't very fresh. And so you have this kind of like revulsion and disgust or whatever. And that's a very normal, natural response. But it's not a spiritual response. It is basically a bodily response that you are receiving. And so Thomas is saying that whole realm of what we talk about as the passions uh, isn't going to be applicable to the disembodied soul in heaven. And I think that's probably correct. That instead, when we talk about like the joy in heaven or the sorrow in hell, it's not going to be like that, where it's a thing simply received. It is much more. Um, so you could imagine a different kind of disgust where you think about somebody really uncharitably and you come to a place of being completely disgusted by them. Or you think about a situation and you're moved to just total sorrow. Where it's not just like a natural sort of bodily reaction, there's sort of a movement of the soul that is connected to it. That seems to endure. The question then becomes, okay, if the soul is capable of that in heaven, by virtue of still being a spiritual movement rather than a bodily one or one of the sensitive appetite, uh, is that consistent with the joy of heaven? And I think I don't understand this well enough to speak intelligently, so I don't want to say too much. But we have like the martyrs crying out for justice on earth, and there does seem to be a sort of eros in heaven. I believe this is one of the things that Saint Benedict talks about in Deus Caritas Est. Let me see if I can find. If I can find where that is. It's yeah, Paris like 3 to 11. I'm not gonna be able to read all of that right now, but if you read that part, like the first 11 paragraphs of Deus Caritas Est, I think you're going to find um, some kind of answer to that in a richer way than I can give right now. Because he talks about how since which even God has an eros for man, a love of longing, in other words. That's not the same thing as sorrow, but if you understand what sorrow is about at its non-passionate level, but as a movement of the will, it seems to be closely connected to the idea of a longing. Because in both cases, the question is how could there be longing in heaven? How could there be sadness in heaven if the soul is totally satisfied? And I think that the answer is the soul is satisfied as to itself, but the saints still want our good, and God still wants our good. And so there's a certain sense in which we can talk about them sorrowing for us and longing for us on our behalf, not on their own behalf. All right. Humble Nomad says, hey, Joe, I love your books. Question: I'm about to start my first class for my MA in Applied Catholic Theology at the University of Mary. Wonderful. Any tips/advice for the academic journey? God bless. I don't know if you're doing it in person or if you're doing it remotely, but if you're doing it in person, I went to the University of Mary to speak. I don't know, maybe in January. I think it was in January, and was really impressed. And one of the things I was really impressed by was the daily liturgy that is available, like just between daily mass and vespers communally and everything else. And I would say, as you are pouring yourself into this, everything I said a moment ago about when you're in law school, keep your foot on the gas pedal. This is a short period of time. This is one of the things where, imagine it like this: looking back, are you more likely to regret that you tried too hard in school and it cut off all of your social connections and all of that? Or are you more likely to regret that you didn't try hard enough, that your social life and your, you know, um, life of pleasure and luxury and all of this got in the way of devoting yourself? For most people, the second regret is much more likely than the first. I don't know you. Maybe your story is different. Maybe you're a real workaholic who's likely to push everybody away. But what often happens is that people have these moments in time where there's a real privileged opportunity to study without any expectation of doing anything else. And some of you are young enough to not know what a privilege and a joy that is. Um, take full advantage of that. And study more than you have to pass. Just take this as a time, not simply to get a degree, but to really get a greater mastery of the subject. I mean, obviously, you're not going to completely master divinity, master theology, but you can have a greater um, kind of knowledge, and you can have a greater facility with knowing where to go to find the right answer for things and all of those things. This is a great time to build that up. And I would say get rid of anything unnecessary that keeps you from being able to pour yourself into that. But while you are doing that, keep yourself rooted in prayer and keep yourself rooted in right relationship with God. Because the temptation will be to cut off your relationship with God while continuing draining relationships with other people. And that is almost the inverse. Now, you may still be called to keep relationships with people who are taxing and draining and all of that, but you want to have good boundaries there so you can give yourself over uh, to the life of study. For both of you, if you want a good book, Sir Delange has a good book on the intellectual life. So let me see if I can. Yes. So the Dominican priest by the name Antonin Serdelange, and that is Serti. You know what? I'm going to drop it in the chat because this is a great book if you want a good high level understanding of kind of the spirituality of the intellectual life and how to do it well. And then the other one I would recommend is just like a 12-page PDF that is available online by Simone Bay called Reflections on the Right Use of School Studies with a View to the Love of God. Nice. Somebody in the comments also said, I advise you to read The Intellectual Life by Sir Delange. Yes, that is, there you go. Oh, my screen is glitching. Well, I apologize for that. It sometimes glitches on this end. I don't know why that happens. So all I can say is sorry. I think it would be more expensive to fix than to just for us all to pretend we don't notice it. That's the most avoidant thing I've ever said publicly. And I've said plenty of avoidant things otherwise. All right. Victor says, what do I do when all my experiences with the sacraments leave me entirely wiped out and exhausted? I'm feeling intimidated and inadequate lately. This is a hard one without knowing a lot more about your life. This could be a good sign to get a spiritual director. There's a few things to know. Saint Ignatius of Loyola has some very good writings on what to do in sort of discernment in these moments. And there are some very good Ignatian authors who kind of unpack this with discernment of spirits and everything. I'm totally blanking on his name. Let me see if I can find Father Timothy Gallagher. He's got some good books that can also be very helpful in just discerning, like, what is God doing in my life? The general rule when you're having a time of desolation, which it sounds like you might be, is that if this is authentically a time of desolation, to keep doing the good things that you've committed yourself to doing, and that it is better to do them faithfully, even if you don't get any kind of emotional high out of it. And that this can be an act of just incredible fidelity. Think about it this way. If you're married, there may come a time when marriage doesn't feel fun. So, for example, your wife is pregnant, so like your normal interaction is different and she's hormonal, and so she maybe doesn't feel about you the same emotional butterflies she did when you first met, and then she has a baby and it's really painful, and there's someone demanding both of your attention in the middle of the night, and all these things can happen. And in the midst of that, couples can be like, well, I just don't feel the same way I felt before. And it's like, you know what? It really doesn't matter. Power through. Just keep doing the things you know you're supposed to be doing. And eventually, God willing, those good feelings and all of that will come back, or will come back at a greater volume, you know? And And until then, just stick with it. Love your spouse even when it doesn't feel fun to love them. And similarly, when it comes to God, the same thing is true, that we just love God even when it doesn't feel fun. The last time, I think 2 weeks ago, I gave a quote from St. Francis de Sales in his introduction to the devout life, where like a child can weep at their mom having surgery, but then if you ask for the candy that they're holding or the apple they're holding, they won't part with it. It's like, okay, well, that's a cheap, kind of superficial emotion then, if it doesn't translate into action. And so the flip side, and so that's one thing to watch out for. You can have all the right emotions. You feel, oh, I'm so in love with my wife. I'm so in love with God. And then it's like, but are you going to actually do the right thing? Are you going to act towards them as you ought to? Or are you going to make the sacrifices you're called to? And they're like, no, I just really like big feelings. Okay. Well, that was a waste of time then. But the flip side is if you make the right actions, if you do the right thing with the right intention, whether the big feelings are there or not is basically irrelevant, because the big feelings are there to basically grease the skids, to make it a little easier to do the hard thing. And doing the hard thing is the more important thing. So keep at it, even when things are tough. Now, that's the general kind of advice. Now, the reason I said it can be helpful to have a spiritual director is that sometimes when people believe they're in desolation, what's actually going on is that there's some kind of red flag in their life. Like you're not getting enough sleep, or you're mired in sin in such a way that it is keeping you from the heights of sanctity towards which you've been called. There's a helpful distinction between these things in the book The Fire Within by Father Thomas Dubay. That can be a helpful thing because people are always like, "Oh, I'm going through the dark night of the soul," and it's like, no, you're staying up till 4 playing Fortnite. That's not the same thing. Like, yes, you are dry in prayer, but it's not because you're so holy. It's because you're, just doing the bare minimum. So take better care of yourself, give something better to God, and then a lot of these problems will go away. So that's the kind of thing. The other thing that factors into this is to uh, recognize if you have like scrupulosity or something that may be coming in as well. So again, that's something that can be better kind of diagnosed and recognized by a spiritual director, but that's one of the places where a one size fits all spiritual counsel falls short. But I hope that helps. All right. Decent Fellowship says, could you explain the virtue of poverty as understood by the church? Yes. So the idea is that there are certain things that draw us away from God. And one of the things that can easily draw us away from God is having too much stuff. And it can be really harmful to relationships in ways that we often don't even talk about. Like we often talk about it in the concrete of like, oh, if you're, really consumed by greed. Sure. But there's this moment in Genesis where Abraham and Lot have to go their separate ways because their flocks are too large. They're so wealthy that they can no longer live together uh, because the herds that they have are too big and they're getting intermingled. And so this ends up driving Lot and his family to Sodom and Gomorrah. Now, I'm not saying that either of them sinned in that situation, but it shows that there can be this very quiet, destructive effect that sin has. Um, the American version of that, I would suggest, would be like the large house. A lot of countries, you have multi generational families in homes where grandma is there with the kids and the grandkids. And there's something really beautiful about that. You might even have the cousins in the same home, etc. Or you have at least, the kids sharing a room. And instead, we have this model in the US, and it's not all bad, but it has spiritual dangers associated with, where like every kid gets their own room and there's an expectation of privacy. And then it's like, oh, it turned out they were doing all sorts of evil things in there. And no one was checking in on them, and no one was aware of what was going on in their life because they were able to hide behind this veil of privacy. And that's a weird kind of consequence of wealth that we don't often talk about. That a lot of those things would just not be possible in somewhere where you're, sharing a small space with a bunch of other people. A lot of the things that people kind of spiral out in, where they become really isolated and it becomes really bad, are things that happen in, small families and big homes, or big families and big homes. And you wouldn't really get that same dynamic in a big family in a small home. So that's just a first thing to kind of bear in mind. Um, Jesus says, "Woe to you, rich," and he also says that it is easier for a camel to enter through the eye of a needle than for a rich man to enter the kingdom. But that all things are possible with God. So we should not treat wealth as simply morally neutral, but as a little bit suspect. That it's not just like, it doesn't matter if you're rich or poor, we're all equally. It's like, no, no, the rich are actually in a place where it can be harmful. And so, what is the church's solution to this when we're talking about like the vow of poverty? The whole idea is to be open handed with what you have. However much you've been given by God, recognize the universal destination of goods, that these things are created by God for all of his children, not just for the children with big bank accounts. And so if you have a big bank account, use that for the upbuilding of the church, use it for the upbuilding of the people of God and for the human race. And that's like a good way of letting go. Even here, I would caution that the temptation is to attach control to money. So think of it like this: money is almost uniquely a danger in this regard. Like money is a gift, and as a gift, it is meant for the upbuilding of the kingdom. But it is also a danger. The an example I would give is this: like if you've got $1 million that you give to your parish, there's a good chance you're going to be like, and I want you to use it on X and Y and Z, and I want you to do this and that and the other thing. And you don't see that nearly as much with other gifts. Like if you're a soprano, for example, and you have a beautiful voice, you might say, I'm only going to sing if you do this song and that song and the other song. You might. I'm sure it happens. I mean, divas exist. But there's a good chance you would just say, like, I am at the service of the church. I will sing whatever I can as long as I'm, it's not something like heretical or, terrible. But within broad limits, I'm just at the service of the parish, whatever you want. It's much more common, it seems to me, that when we give with strings attached. And we should be careful about that. That's not to say it's always bad. Sometimes it's good to have strings attached, but it's dangerous because at a certain point, you're no longer giving, you're investing. If you say, like, I'm going to give money to my parish so they can have this program I really want, at a certain point, you're just buying a program, which is fine. Might be good even, but it's not giving in the same sense because you haven't let go of it. And so the whole point of a vow of poverty is this radical letting go. So you might, having taken a vow of poverty, be well cared for. You might have a comfortable place to sleep, your meals provided for, etc. You're not living poverty in the way most of the world thinks of poverty, and you're living better off than most of the world. But you've let go. You're not the one calling the shots with it. And so this desire for control that is often accompanied with great wealth, you've let go of that. Having said that, there are some communities that go even further and they will live intentional poverty in both senses, both the letting go and living lives of radical simplicity and austerity. And there can be a real beauty in that. It's not the universal call. And it's not even the universal call for those who've taken a vow of poverty. But I know, for example, here in Kansas City, we have a group called the Community of the Lamb. And they got in a fight with the state of Kansas when they were building their monastery because Kansas insisted on them having things like showers with running water. And they're like, we don't take showers with hot water. We just use a bucket of cold water. And like, none of what they wanted was passing housing code. Like the doorways, they wanted these really low doorways. You had to stoop to come through, which is part of their spirituality. And they were like, no, because if there's a fire and a firefighter has to get in, that's really dangerous. So they had this crazy back and forth. But in the back and forth, they wanted the thing that was a little harder, the thing that required more simplicity. Last thing I'll say on this, I was at Family Week at Benedictine earlier this summer. And one of the things that a couple shared, there was like couples that would share kind of testimonies. And one of the couples lived a life of pretty radical voluntary poverty with their family. And they just never had enough money for luxuries, and they were content for that to be the case. And what they said was the standard with which you raise your children will be the standard they think of as normal. Like, they don't think of themselves as poor or rich as kids. They just think of themselves as normal. And so I mean, I remember this growing up. We didn't have a lot of money, but I was friends with a kid who had less money. And he came over and saw that our house had 2 stories, and he was stunned. Like, it was like a mansion to him. He lived out in a small house in the country, and then seeing this house in the city that had 2 stories to it, not even in a great neighborhood or anything, he was just so impressed. I remember being like, "Wow, I never thought of my house as really nice." And it was an eye-opening experience for me because I often was, in school with kids where, like, their families made more money and was used to being on the other end of that. Uh, and it was a Yeah, even from, like, a 6th grade perspective, I was like, "Oh, okay, I think there's something here." And so that's what I would say is, like, you have the opportunity with your kids to set the bar low enough that they're easily satisfied and pleased and impressed, and that can actually be a good that you give them later on. I don't know whether that's good counsel or not, but it's something that was said, at this point, almost 2 months ago, and it's really stuck with me. And we've thought as a couple about, like, okay, even things that aren't super expensive, just like, do we get ice cream with our kids too much during the summer, or do we, trying to cut back on things so that the luxuries feel like luxuries and the benefits and the perks really feel like benefits and perks, even if you can give more. That may not be the thing that is the best thing to do for your kids. So that was some of the virtue of poverty as understood by the church. Some of it was just me riffing on poverty. All right. Judah Silverman says, my parents are dispensational, and I've tried talking with them about it, and they say it isn't essential, so it doesn't matter. How to approach/show them how serious it is. Yeah, I would just say, notice in the life of Jesus, people misunderstood what he meant by the temple, like in John 2, and they didn't understand that he meant the temple of his body and not a physical building in Jerusalem. A lot of dispensationalism does the same thing with the temple in Israel, taking these things that are actually about Christ and the church and applying them in a much more physical way. And it's the same kind of error. So it's worth asking, just like, well, would it have been a problem for people to misunderstand Jesus like this? And clearly the answer was yes. So, yeah, I think we're in a weird place right now when it comes to anything about Israel because of things like the wars in the Middle East and the way, like, Gen Z discourse on Israel Palestine has gotten really radicalized in both directions. It is very hard to have a sane, sober conversation with, like, your normie boomer parents about, like, oh, no, this is actually a bigger deal than you think it is, but maybe less of a big deal than, like, the guy on campus thinks it is, to get this right. And in general, the thing I try to tell people on theological topics is, like, if we love God, we want to understand him and his message for us. Like, if you don't think this matters, then why do you call yourself dispensationalist? If you don't care what Jesus is teaching about Israel or the church, then why not just say, I'm apathetic? Don't say dispensational. Just say, I don't care. Um, that's how I would kind of approach it. Of, like, just call out, we should care about proper theology. And it does seem like this is an area where it has major implications for maybe your geopolitics, but also just how you think about theology, and certainly how you think about the church. If some of these things that people have been applying to the state of Israel are actually about the church, and they should be investing that same love and energy towards building up the Catholic Church that they've been loving and energetically building up the state of Israel, that's a good thing to know. Because for one thing, it would probably mean they should become Catholic. So that's how I would kind of approach it. But then the other thing, Judah, I don't know how old you are. I don't know your own kind of story. But as someone kind of in the middle between these two generations, probably, there can be a sense in which they're both extreme in kind of opposite directions. And the example I would give would be something like the Vietnam War. If you were, say, a person living in the 60s, and you've got the parents' generations just like, well, of course, the US should, fight communism by sending a bunch of troops to Vietnam. And then the younger generation is like, you're a murderer. You should be a radical pacifist. Now, we can look back in hindsight. I think it's uncontroversial to say both of those positions were wrong. Both extremes were naive and oversimplified and all of this. Um, and that's often how things are when we're talking about theology and when we're talking politics, where the truth is often a little more nuanced than the loudest voices would have you believe. And so this is one of those areas where I would say to maybe you and your parents, there might be more room for nuance here than you'd get from the internet. And so it's not the worst error to be a dispensationalist, but it is an error, and it's an error worth correcting. Maury Ocho says, "Hi Joe, I have a question. How does the predestination St. Thomas talked about work? Also, I'm entering seminary soon. Please pray for me." Yeah, this is hotly disputed, actually, even among Thomistic scholars. And it's not the kind of question I can answer adequately quickly. Let me sketch out very broad brush strokes. Um, Number one, there is a sense in which God loves all men and desires all men to be saved and come to the knowledge of the truth. This is something Thomas is clear on, and this is something that we all actually must believe. It is part of the doctrine of the church. And it's clearly in scripture. And Christ dies for all men, not for us only, but for the whole world. So the non-limited nature of the atonement is a really critical thing to get right in this. And this is going to be one of those areas where the predestination and soteriology of St. Thomas Aquinas is going to be different from what you get from a tulip Calvinist, because the L in tulip is limited atonement, and that is the area where it's most clearly at odds with Catholicism. You can find plenty of overlap in the predestination theologies of particularly the Benesian followers of St. Thomas. But on the issue of the limited atonement, that is going to be something that is different. Like, there's some sense we have to affirm that God wants even the damned to have been saved. And Jesus is abundantly clear about this. He weeps over Jerusalem, right? Like, he mourns those who are going the wrong way. So we want to get all that right. But the other thing to get right is that God gives different amounts of graces to different people. There's an inequality of physical gifts. We already saw that in the conversation about money. There's also an inequality in spiritual gifts, and that includes the graces needed for salvation. So everyone gets enough to be saved. Some people, take the Virgin Mary, get more. Mary gets prevenient graces that keep her from original sin and from actual sin. And so there is this question that is hotly debated on why God doesn't give more divine aid to those who are ultimately damned. Because we can say, and should say, that they're damned because of their own choices. They rejected the graces that God gave them, but you can easily counter, well, why didn't God give them more graces to help soften their hearts so they wouldn't reject the graces they were given? And there's a part of that is simply impossible to answer in a satisfactory sort of way. You will find some speculative theories from Dominicans and then, on the other hand, from Jesuits. But the church's own position here is just, we're going to leave this one alone. This is what's called the De Auxiliis controversy. And I think that's wise because we can go too deeply in this. And so Thomas will even talk about a sense in which we can affirm something like reprobation, not in the sense of God actively choosing to hate people that would deny the universal salvific will, but that there are some people that he sort of abandons to the decisions that they've made against him in ways that can be a little bit inscrutable. And then you get into this whole question about foreseen, unforeseen merits and all of that. So I'm going to leave some of those deeper issues off the table and just affirm what I think is the common nucleus where we want to make sure we know God loves your neighbor. He loves you. He loves your neighbor. He loves every person you've ever met. Christ died for them. He wants them to be saved. And some people have been given more spiritual gifts than others. And one of the ways of sort of harmonizing these things is recognizing that the gifts we have are for the upbuilding of the church. for the building of the body of Christ. It's the exact same thing about like why does God make some people rich and some poor? There's a beautiful exegesis on this by cannot remember now if it was Leo the Great. You know what? Permit me. I think I might be able to find it. Luke 8, Jesus goes out preaching and is accompanied by wealthy women. And one of the points one of the fathers made, I can't find it easily enough. All right, I'm going to abandon it. Is that there's something really good about one serving the spiritual needs and needing the financial assistance, and one serving the financial needs and needing the spiritual assistance. Like the sense in which we are permitted to need one another for our own good is planned by God. Because one of the things you can ask is, why doesn't God just give everyone every gift? Part of the answer seems to be because he wants us to grow in harmony with one another, and he wants us to need each other and rely on each other. But that also means that if you've been given a spiritual gift that your neighbor hasn't, maybe that is a sign that it is your job to use that spiritual gift for your neighbor's salvation. All right. This stream, Omega Rio, donated $2. Thank you. Jack says, favorite decade of the Rosary and why? Ha! Great question. I mean, the crucifixion, fifth sorrowful mystery, is like the easy answer there. The salvation of the world. There's something just really powerful, particularly with the flow of the sorrowful mysteries, where you build up towards the crucifixion, and then you can really pray on that well. I find that sometimes I'll pray just like a decade in isolation, and it isn't as powerful as when you build it. You are walking the steps with Jesus, as it were, and the carrying of the cross, and then you get to the crucifixion. There's something just very powerful about that if you're allowing your mind to focus on those mysteries. Yeah. So in terms of just sheer powerfulness, but I really like the visitation, the second joyful mystery, and this sense of when Mary receives Jesus, the first thing she does is shares him with others. There's something so beautiful about that. Like we're all called to do that. All right. Vivi Corey says, what would be your advice to someone who wants to get married, but their partner is Protestant, doesn't want to get married in the Catholic Church? Breaking up is not an option. I mean, he just has a lot of trauma with Catholicism. Yeah, I would say that is the tip of a big iceberg, because someday you're going to have children potentially with this man, or man. And you're going to want to raise that child Catholic. In fact, if you're getting married, you're going to promise to raise that child Catholic. And if he's got a bunch of trauma, it seems like one of a couple things might happen. Number one, he will counter signal. He'll say, like, actually, that religion is false. It teaches all this false doctrine. And he might say it gently, but he'll communicate that to your children and undermine their faith and do a tremendous amount of damage to them. Or he'll be like, okay, you guys go do that. I'm going to stay home, or I'm going to go to Protestant church. We've got a cool band. You guys go enjoy church. And so even if he's not like actively contradicting you, by simply not being on the same page, kids will pick up on that. And it will start to raise questions and doubts in their mind. And it puts them in this really terrible position as children to be like, either dad might be sinning, there might be something that is a threat to his salvation, or it doesn't really matter whether you're Catholic or Protestant, or this religion thing just doesn't matter in general. Like those are the kind of places a kid is going to naturally end up exposed to that. So I would view this situation you're facing right now as the tip of a very big iceberg, and recognize, like, you say breaking up now isn't an option. I don't know why it's not an option. It's not an option after you get married. But even if you've got past history, even if you have kids together, you are not required to get married to someone who does not want to get married in the Catholic Church. And that might be a sign that he's not ready to get married. I would focus a lot on having him address the trauma. And if it actually is like if this is drama or trauma and not drama, then I would say having someone who's like a licensed mental health professional who can helpfully steer and guide him with whatever traumatic experiences maybe he had, or to address them in whatever other ways are appropriate. If it's just that he's had like bad experiences with Catholicism and it's not actually traumatic, working through those things. Now, you might be able to get a dispensation to marry outside the church so you can have a valid marriage. Uh, you can sometimes have a situation where a priest can marry you not in a physical church building. That can be a sort of compromise solution. It needs the approval of the bishop. But I would caution there that that might just be kicking the problem down the road and creating a situation where now you have to deal with the deeper, more underlying problem once you're married and your options are more limited. So, yeah, I would say see how serious he is at working through this and maybe stress to him being Catholic is not some incidental part of who you are. And you understand and appreciate that he's been wounded by Catholics, by the Catholic Church, maybe by whatever the experiences that he's had are, but that you want a situation in which you can share the most valuable thing about yourself, your Catholic faith, with the people you love the most, him and any children that God may put in your life. And then the ball's kind of in his court of like, what's he going to do about it? Is he going to allow his bad experiences to get in the way of his love for you or not? Because right now you're putting this burden on yourself, and this isn't a burden that is on you. This is a burden that is on him. Like something is keeping him from the fullness of the truth, and you can maybe be a helpful role there, but don't, if you start compromising now, it doesn't get better after you're married. It doesn't get easier. I've never met a situation where somebody said, I lowered my standards so I could get married, and then my standards went back up afterwards. It's like, no, no. Once you do that, just expect them to keep going down and down and down and down, and until there's nothing left. I unfortunately I've known situations in which good Catholic women have allowed themselves, for the sake of a man they loved, to be slowly drawn away from the church. And so you want to watch out for that. You want a man you can look up to and trust and that can lead your family spiritually. And this is an opportunity for your fiance or partner, whatever, to step up and show that he can be that man. Sorry, I wish I had more encouraging news, but I think it could be. I mean, maybe that means see what his objections are, get really specific about it, and then connect him with people who aren't you, who can talk some of these things through with him. Because sometimes somebody will just have like a theological hang up and they need somebody to talk to about it. If it is just like really bad traumatic experiences, then, I mean, have that conversation for sure. All right. Lovato's Canine Training. Cool. Says, hey, Joe, love what you do. You're a blessing for me as a 5-month Catholic from Protestantism. God bless you. I'm fully convinced of the faith, but I want to understand the Catholic view on filioque. Super confused about the Noah and Adjun debate. I did not see that debate, so I will probably not be able to help at a granular level. Maybe somebody else in the comments can. But here's the basic thing. The Father begets the Son. The Father breathes the Spirit. This is what's called spiration. And so this is going to be the first distinguishing fact that distinguishes the second person of the Trinity from the third person of the Trinity. Because here's our issue. If you are looking at 3 people in a family, a father, a mother, and a son, that sort of thing, you can easily distinguish those 3. They're distinguished by matter. They have different bodies, right? And if you've got like Siamese twins, maybe it's a little more murky, but there's still some kind of distinguishing principle. Their heads are distinct or something like this. When we're talking about the Trinity, we're talking about spiritual persons who share the same divine substance in an undivided way. So the question becomes, how do we distinguish the Father from the Son from the Holy Spirit? Because they, in pictures it's easy because they have separate bodies, but they don't actually have separate bodies. So that's not the distinction. And the distinction is instead something like this: the Father is uncreated and unbegotten and unspirated. He is the origin. And sometimes the use of the term monarch is used, but this can be kind of confusing because there's a heretical interpretation of this as well. But he is the originator, and he begets the Son. The Son does not beget the Father. The Father begets the Son and shares with the Son everything of what it is to be God. And the one thing he doesn't give to the Son is fatherhood, right? Because he can't give him the fatherhood. So the Son is Father in an analogous sense. If you read like the prophecies in Isaiah, he's called Father forever, but not in the divine paternity sort of way that God the Father is within the Trinity. With me so far? Because now you have the Spirit. And with the Spirit, the Father spirates the Spirit. This isn't a creation in time or anything like this. This is an eternal spiration, just like the eternal begetting. So now we can say there's a first thing that is distinct, where one is begotten and one is spirated. But here's where the filioque comes in, because we would say, well, no, the Father spirates the Spirit. That's true. But he also spirates the Spirit through the Son. Now, this does two things. One, it helps to explain what the difference is between the second and the third person of the Trinity is at a deeper level. Two, it shows us the relationship of the second and the third person of the Trinity. So imagine the Trinity triangle. You got the Father at the top, you've got the second person here, you got the third person here. In some of the Orthodox model, I'm not going to universalize that, but in some of the Orthodox models, it's very clear why the Father's at the top, how the second and third person logically follow from the Father, but the connection between the second and the third person is hard to see. We see their relationship to the Father, we don't see their relationship to each other. In the proper understanding of the filioque, the Father spirates the Spirit through the Son. The controversy in the East for a long time was that it sounded like a double origin. The Father and the Son working together spirate the Spirit, in which the Father is no longer at the top of the pyramid. They have the Father and the Son at the top of the pyramid. And the Orthodox have a lot of problems with that, but the issue is that's not what Catholics are affirming. They're rejecting a sort of straw man version of it. Now, we can then talk about an understanding that is shared actually between the East and West, where there certainly is a sense in which we see the Son breathing the Spirit. We see the Father sending the Spirit through the Son in God's work in salvation history. Now, we would say on the Catholic side, what we know about the inner life of God is known first and foremost from the outer life of God. We don't have direct access into God's inner life. So our two ways in are, number one, testimony, what he tells us, and number two, demonstration, what he shows us. So when we see the Father acting as Father, when we see the Son becoming incarnate, when we see the Son breathing the Spirit, this shows us the interplay of the different persons of the Trinity. And this external thing is a witness to the inner life of God. So that's the idea. I think many of the arguments against the filioque historically were, number one, arguments less about the actual theology and more about just the idea of monkeying with the creed, and particularly the Pope having a hand in that. And number two, arguments rooted in a misunderstanding of what Western Christians actually believe about the filioque. So overwhelmingly, the Christians on earth believe in the filioque, and I think it's a very easy thing to see why one would. A lot of the debates get super into the weeds, and people trying to treat it as some kind of like horrible heresy are really arguing that like most of Christianity fell into heresy way before the Great Schism, and that the Eastern Fathers were basically fine with or tolerant of the Western Church all falling into heresy way before the Great Schism, and then it was only like in the second millennium, basically, that they realized how bad this was. I think that whole version of history does not stand up well, uh, because during this time you can find these glowing odes to the Pope about how the Roman See is untarnished by heresy and all of this stuff. And we're supposed to believe in hindsight, like actually it was tarnished by heresy, terrible Trinitarian heresy, and they knew it. And they still wrote these really amazing odes to the West and to the Pope specifically, just as an honorific or something. I think that is not a very serious theory. And the more you get into the details on it, the more you're like, no, no. They're actually saying the Pope has this authority and that the Roman See has this special prerogative of being untouched by heresy and all of this. So I hope that helps. Omega Rio says, why is purgatory considered bad? Without it, wouldn't many more people be in hell? Yeah, purgatory is a grace. It's like saying, why is summer school bad? Well, you don't want to aim for it, but if it's that or failing, then it's better. Summer school is not actually a great analogy because it isn't like you're getting a second chance, but it is the process of being spiritually purified. And being spiritually purified hurts, but it's for your good. So purgatory is a grace. Theologo says, hey, Joe, recently a Baptist church deeply connected to my Catholic club's college held a deeply anti-Catholic sermon. We were writing a script for a video dissecting the arguments made. Do you have script writing advice? I'll give you a little bit of general script writing advice. Oh yeah, sorry. Somebody asked about the order. I'm doing these in the order the super chats came in. Occasionally, I'll pull in other questions if they're really good and I just happen to see them. But usually, there's enough that come in with the super. Like I've got a bunch already with super chats, so I don't know if that's likely to happen or not. If I don't get to your question this time, I will get to it next time. I always do. Okay, so script writing advice. Number 1, be charitable. Number 2, be clear. Don't assume that they know and reject Catholic teaching. Assume that they are trying to understand a system that is not native to them, not familiar, and that they're just messing it up. Number 3, try to draw out the implications of what they're saying. Frequently, it happens that if you take a Protestant claim seriously, it would mean that Christianity virtually disappeared from Earth until the Reformation. And that's not all Protestant theories by any stretch. But when somebody says something like that, in my debate with Ryan from Need God, when he claimed that anyone who trusted that baptism was saving is going to hell, he's damning every Christian we know about, basically. Maybe not even basically. Maybe I'll just say basically to be careful here. Prior to like the Reformation. And there's something so on face absurd about that to a normal human being that just pointing that out is enough for most people to be like, okay, you're being silly. Like if your sect teaches something so radical that either you're going to hell or everyone else is going to hell, normal people can understand what the right answer there is. So you can kind of appeal to that, like just show what the stakes are. There is next a tendency to over argue, under argue, meaning if you can make your case actually a little weaker than it actually is. If somebody sees your case and they're analyzing it and they're like, no, actually, this is really stronger than I initially thought, that's good. If they look at your case and you over argued it and you say, no one, so for example, take the thing I just said. If I said like literally no one ever prior to the Reformation denied baptismal regeneration, you could do some digging and be like, well, the Gnostics did. True. Not helpful, but, and that sort of thing then undermines my credibility. And so what I try to do, and sometimes I fail to do this because I'll think a thing is like really open and shut and airtight, and I won't even think about like, well, maybe I should add more nuance and caveats. If you undersell it a little bit and it's stronger than you presented, and then the person digs in and they find it's an even stronger case, that can be helpful as well. Let's see. Additional advice. Show that you know and love Jesus. Because frequently when you're dealing with the kind of people susceptible to an anti-Catholic sermon like that, they don't think Catholics love Jesus. They don't think Catholics love the Bible. It's fascinating. Another of my debates, the debate I did with Doug Wilson. If you read the comments there, there's a fair number of people who are just like, Catholics hate the Bible. Look at how much this guy must hate the Bible because I don't believe in sola scriptura. And anytime you attack sola scriptura, you've got people who are not very charitable or understanding of what the actual issues are, who will be like, either you accept this doctrine or you don't love the Bible. Showing that you love the Bible, even while you recognize that the Bible doesn't present itself as the sole infallible rule of faith and doesn't ever claim to be that, that can be a little bit difficult, but try to do that. Make it hard for people to interpret you in a malicious and an uncharitable way because they will want to do that. If they can write you off so they don't have their own belief systems challenged, they will. And then I would encourage some kind of call to action, whether it's like reading the church fathers or a debate or something like this, where it's not just there is a sermon and then a letter and then that's it, but giving them something to kind of call them to. All right, I hope that helps. Antonio says, how can we present evidence for modern day miracles without overstating our case? Great questions. Just very much in keeping with what I was just saying. For example, Eucharistic miracles vary widely in evidence quality. I think say that. And here's what I like to say with miracles. A lot of things look like miracles and aren't. And the Catholic Church recognizes this, regularly investigates these things, and writes off a lot of them as either non-miraculous or inconclusive. From a Catholic perspective, that's fine. If we're looking at 100,000 purported miracles, maybe 90% of them are purely natural. Okay? That leaves 10,000. Maybe 99% have a non-miraculous explanation. That leaves 1,000 miracles. Maybe more than that. But if there's one miracle, one Eucharistic miracle, for example, that does more to prove the Catholic case than any number of probabilistic arguments. Because there are some options that are simply off the table. If one Eucharistic miracle is true, Protestantism is false, Orthodoxy is false in as much as it denies the validity of Catholic sacraments. SSPX is false if they deny the validity of the Catholic Mass and that God would show approval with these miracles. It's a little more disputed there, but I know that there have been people who've come back from the SSPX to the Catholic Church because of Eucharistic miracles that happen in Novus Ordo Masses. And at the very least, you've now narrowed down the candidates. Obviously, things like atheism and all that are completely off the board. So the atheist has to show there's zero valid miracles. And showing that there are some things that are believed to be miracles that aren't doesn't get them any closer to doing that. Like if we have a bank vault full of money and you're able to show a lot of the money in here is counterfeit, that does not mean that all the money in there is counterfeit. It may just be the money that you've chosen is. And maybe you chose the money that was the most obviously counterfeit looking. Just like maybe the miracles you chose to take apart were the ones that looked like the easiest to take apart. Okay. But counterfeit money doesn't disprove the existence of real money. It actually, in that case, relies on it. And so counterfeit miracles, whether malicious or people just being naive, that doesn't disprove the existence of the real miraculous. So that's what I would say. Like, lay out the stakes very clearly. And then if they say, like, oh, I don't believe in these, a lot of these are just like hucksters and all this other stuff, usually the person who says that has not taken any kind of close examination. And then just press them to look at the strong cases closely. And then remind them of what the stakes are if any of these are real. Atheism's disproved. All right. Mike says, big fan, Joe. Thanks, Mike. My question is, how can I explain the forgiveness of sin and how sin is viewed by the Catholic Church when it comes to homosexuality? My friend's mom is in a homosexual relationship, and I have a hard time trying to explain my Catholic view. Yeah. Good question. Couple things. One, all of us sin and fall short of the glory of God. What is needed is repentance, turning away from sin. Now, repentance and turning away from sin does not mean you're not going to screw up again. It does mean that you're going to try not to screw up again. And so, one of the issues that we're faced with here, and this is true as well if you have an ongoing heterosexual relationship that is immoral, is that the relationship itself is ordered in the wrong direction. So, if a guy is cheating on his wife and he says, "Honey, I have a confession to make. I've been cheating on you." And then she finds out all the details, finds out he has a long-term mistress and that they're, dating. It would be unreasonable for him to say, "I want you to forgive me, but I'm not ready to break up with her." Because at a certain point, you're just asking her to sanction this thing that cannot be sanctioned. The same thing is true here. The call is to end a relationship that is not conducive towards this higher relationship that you have. The other woman might be a lovely human being. It might be the easiest thing in the world to imagine why they're together. That doesn't matter in light of a higher calling. Like if your friend's mom was trying to save her marriage to your friend's dad, I don't know any other situation, right? She would obviously have to break up with this girlfriend that she has. Well, similarly, if she wants to have right relationship with God, she has to break up with this girlfriend that she has. And in doing so, it's not impugning any malice or wickedness or, worthlessness to the other woman. It's just recognizing that concretely she's an obstacle um, in that capacity, in that role as girlfriend, to a healthier, better relationship, to the relationship that your friend's mom's actually made for. So then you can have a deeper conversation about the way we are made, the way we are designed. One thing that my friend Marco has said, he's someone who's been very open about his struggles with same-sex attraction. And what he found helpful was the realization that he is heterosexually oriented at a bodily level, which means this. I think I've used this example before. So there's it was a KLM or Royal Dutch Airlines, KLM. Yep. They have, let's see if I can drop it in the chat so you can see what I'm talking about. I'm not sure if that link worked or not. Okay, well, hopefully that link works. It's a Pride post that KLM Airlines had. So it doesn't matter who you click with, happy Pride Amsterdam. And they showed a seatbelt. And one, they had a normal seatbelt with a masculine end and a feminine end. One, they had it with two masculine ends, and one, they had it with two feminine ends. And the thing is, regardless of what you feel about how pretty the different seatbelts are, only one of those actually works. And you can tell what each seatbelt part is made for just by looking at it and understanding how a seatbelt works. But the masculine is made for the feminine and the feminine is made for the masculine. And the human body it works the same way. If I look at the respiratory system, I can understand that it's made to respire, and everything about the respiratory system is built with a view for respiration. Everything about the circulatory system is built with a view for circulation, and everything in the reproductive system is built for reproduction. What makes the reproductive system unique is that it is the only part of the human body that is systematically incomplete. That your respiratory system works without needing another body. And your circulatory system, your digestive system, and all of those things. And they interact with the outside world, the air and food and all of that. But they, as systems, work internally. Your reproductive system is not like that. It needs to operate another person's reproductive system. And not just another person, but another person of the opposite sex. And so at a human level, leaving the feelings aside, leaving even the moral judgments to a certain extent aside, we can say this is how the body is built. And so everyone is made in a heterosexual way because nobody's body is completed by another member of the same sex, right? Like no man is getting pregnant from another man. No woman is getting pregnant from another woman. Does not happen. Even when like a lesbian couple announces that they're pregnant, what they mean is that one of the two women has been inseminated by some random guy. That's it. They have dabbled in heterosexuality long enough to produce motherhood. Maybe in a really banal, like lab sort of way, maybe in an adulterous sort of way, whatever the case may be. But that's just biology. And that is apart from any moral judgments you may have. And that should not be a hard thing for us to recognize. But that's what I would stress, right? Like build from that God loves each of us and has plans for each of us. And one of the ways we uncover those plans is looking at how he's created us. And not just our psychology and our emotions and all of that, but even our biology. It reveals something deep and true about us. And sometimes, if we're being honest, our hearts want things that are not good for us. Everyone who's dated long enough can point to crushes and relationships that have not been good for them. Okay. So that can't have the final say. We trust God more than we trust our crush, more than we trust our, romance, more than we trust all of those things. Especially, it sounds like your friend's mom, seemingly, I don't know the story, but presumably there was a dad there at some time and knows this experientially, right? Maybe finds that very cathartic in a lot of ways. But that's what I would say. That's what I would stress there. But do it without a spirit of condemnation, because that's not going to be helpful. But just really letting her see that she is loved. Yeah. And just note, final thing here. Even if you do all of that, and even if you do all of that well, she may still not be open to what you have to say. That just expect that. That is a normal thing that you have to deal with. All right. Knight says, "Hey Joe, I wanted to say thank you for how God is using you, as I am most likely going to join the OCA and become Catholic. Thanks, brother in Christ." Oh, God bless you. Hey guys, if you would say a quick prayer for Knight Cylinder. Look forward to hearing about your journey and hope we can be some help. If you choose a confirmation saint, we'd love to hear more about it. That's wonderful. The gamer says, having difficulty accepting the CCR, I think that is Catholic Charismatic Renewal, and its origins as a convert, especially when it comes to glossolalia and people being slain in the spirit by a priest, is unavoidable at my parish. Thoughts/help. It's strange it's unavoidable at your parish. Maybe you're in like Detroit or something. In a lot of the country, it is very easily avoidable. And so without knowing more, I would say this. If you find it spiritually distracting and it's the kind of thing that there's a real heavy emphasis on, it's not actually sinful to go to a different church for mass. This is a weird myth that a lot of people have, that you have to go to your local parish church. And I think it's based on a basic misunderstanding. You are a part of your parish geographically. That is true. But your parish refers to a region. Like in Louisiana, a parish is a county at the state level. But that's rooted in what the word parish means in Roman law and in French law, which then comes over via Napoleon to Louisiana. Well, similarly in church conversation, that you are part of a diocese geographically, and that's uncontroversial. But when I say you're part of the diocese, that doesn't mean you automatically go to the cathedral for mass. It just means you live in that diocese. You're subject to the laws of that diocese. You're under the spiritual authority of your bishop. The same thing is true at a more local level in your parish. You are part of a parish based on your geography. Whether you go to that church or not, you are part of the parish that church is representative of. And most parishes have one parish church in the boundaries that serves that parish. But if someone is better spiritually fed by getting in the car and going down the street to somewhere else, they are free to do that. Now, you can do that, I think, with a little bit of hesitation, because you can easily turn that into a parish shopping in a way that isn't actually spiritually healthy. But in a situation like you're describing, yeah, that's totally fine to do. I think there's some good that's come out of the Catholic charismatic renewal, but I've got questions myself about what we make of certain things, and certainly things like getting slain in the spirit and all of that. I'm very dubious of. So you can find the spiritual fruit. You can pray for your brothers and sisters in Christ who are part of that, but if it's distracting to your spiritual journey, and you can easily go to another parish, don't feel the slightest compunction about doing that. And it's fine to even share with your pastor. Look, maybe it's something like, I love you. I love a lot of the people here and what you guys are doing, but there's these things I cannot get behind. And um, we need to probably part company here. I don't think I'm going to persuade you not to embrace charismatic praxis. It's present liturgically in a way that is distracting and doesn't really fit the liturgy. And so I'm going to go somewhere where that is not the case. Okay. Oh, this is good timing. João, is that it? Joao. Now I know this is what it's John in Portuguese, right? I was having a conversation about the name recently, and I don't know how to pronounce it, and I've seen it in writing, and I'm sure I've heard it, but I've never paid close enough attention. So I'm sorry if I butchered your name. And we were literally just talking about this weekend because we're thinking about all the different names that exist that are derivatives of James or John, because it was the feast of St. James on Saturday. And there's a ton of names in America that derive from James or John. And keeping straight which ones are from which is really, like, even like John is kind of a confusing one because there's variations of John from Jonathan. Anyway, it doesn't matter. But to your question, as Catholics, can we participate in an MMA competition? Is it a sin? I saw some discussions about this. I'm trying to form my conscience on this topic. Want to know your view, not an English speaker. I'm not a Portuguese speaker, so we're even. I'm torn on it. I know Father Mike Schmitz has cautioned against it. I know Trent has encouraged some kinds of martial arts. It is one of those things that people who know more than I do about the sport itself have different opinions of. I would say this. It is not bad to delight in martial excellence, which can mean sparring and all of that stuff. Like beating a man up for the sake of, like, pouring your wrath out on him would be wrong. But say like soldiers training. Soldiers training is not wrong. It actually is very good. Now, you might actually get hurt doing it, but that's not the point of why you're doing it. So when you have something like mixed martial arts, you're in this weird place that's kind of in between those two examples, where they're not just training with each other, they're actually beating each other up. But they're not motivated by wrath. It is an agreed upon structured sport that hopefully doesn't carry over in any kind of animus between the two parties and all this stuff. If they started fighting again in the parking lot, it'd be like, well, no, they shouldn't be doing that. So the moral issue seems to be if there's something contrary to the dignity of the person having their face pummeled in, right? And that's a good question because there clearly can be. And it seems like there are times where that is true. It seems like there's a line between kind of an occupational hazard and the reason somebody goes. So, if you watch any organized sport, football, soccer, even hockey, certainly, you can watch people get pretty beaten up. And they know going into it that there's a certain amount of getting beaten up that goes along with the sport. It's not why they're doing it, but it's one of the dangers of it. I don't think it's wrong to watch a sport where a guy gets beaten up incidentally. As long as it's not why you're doing it. But somebody who watched because they liked watching people get hurt, that would be wrong. I think that would be clearly contrary to Christian charity. So then the question becomes, with MMA, are we watching because we just like watching people get hurt? I don't actually think that's what motivates people with MMA. I think they like watching the excellence of the winning fighter, not the suffering of the losing fighter. But I think that this is a morally fraught area that you want to be careful with. So I'm not ready to either give a blanket condemnation or a blanket endorsement of it. I think it's one of those things where I have questions about it and would just suggest like spiritually examine why you're watching in the first place. At least I can't watch hockey anymore because she only watched it for the fights. Back in the day, this is going to date me terribly. Back in the early days of Sega, they had a hockey game where you could fight, and I totally played it for the fights. All right. Sergio, no. This is Joe. Sergio, no. Jeff Secretor says, how come no one presses the Protestants on binding and loosing? Their interpretation makes Christianity subjective. We keep arguing verses with them. Without the authority, everyone is lost. I think a lot of people do argue authority. I think the problem is, on the one hand, if you don't have the authority conversation, then it defaults to the Protestant view where everybody's just interpreting however they think is right and then just going with their own private interpretation. And on the other hand, if you do have the authority conversation and it dominates, it can quickly become we've got the Bible on our side. You just have claims to authority on your side. It's like, no, you've got your interpretation of the Bible on your side. There's no reason to think you're interpreting it properly. So the authority conversation is important as part of a broader thing. I like binding and listening as a part of that. The Jewish Encyclopedia has a good article on what binding and listening means in a Jewish context, and showing that this isn't some, crazy Catholic interpretation. This is just what this means, and that the standard Protestant view, or maybe not standard, there's a common Protestant view that binding and listening means something like they get to announce salvation. And the thing I like to press is, so Jesus gave them nothing new then, because they were already doing that. And so nothing happens after Jesus gives them authority compared to before that literally nullifies the word of God. That means you could cut out those portions of the Bible and nothing would change at all. That's a red flag. Like something is wrong if we can just cut out chapters of the Bible and the story doesn't change. So that's what I would suggest there. Hoos6648 says, hey, Joe, if you got to take it to Assisi in 1986, Pope John Paul II, would you go? I don't know. There were things that happened at Assisi that were really ill-advised pastorally. Some of the accounts of Assisi are overstating what happened. And the charge that there was like prayer in common with non-Christians, I think is just factually not true. Because here's the idea. Number one, is there a time and place for a summit with leaders of different religions? I hope the answer to that is certainly yes. And sometimes that's going to be about discussing the issues that divide us. But in a world in which godless communism is threatening nuclear annihilation, might it be permissible for those who believe that there is a God and that we should try to follow him to also publicly and jointly stand up and say, and we believe in peace, and we believe that we should be striving for peace? I think there's a good to that in a way that is not relativism or indifferentism or suggesting that the differences don't matter, that we are all worshiping the same God or anything like that. We can affirm the things that we actually agree on and affirm even something like common cause, maybe some common goodwill on some of those things. So on that first thing, can we have an interreligious gathering for peace? I think that's a perfectly legitimate thing to do. Would I go to it? I don't know. I mean, I think if you asked me why I wouldn't, it would probably be things that don't do me any favors, of like kind of rolling my eyes in sort of a cynicism kind of way. But that's not something I could defend or would want to defend. I should probably be more interested in something like that. So then the question becomes like the particulars of how it looks. And by the way, sorry. There's a Wednesday audience at which John Paul II announces Assisi. And it is so beautiful about the need to preach Christ to these people. And this is, I think, in maybe October 22nd. Yeah, he says in his Wednesday audience of October 22nd, 1986. The church has reflected a lot in the council, under the inspiration of the Holy Spirit, on its position in a world increasingly marked by the meetings of cultures and religions. And I think that is true. That we aren't just occupying a little Catholic ghetto. On the global stage, we are the most important religion on earth, bar none, for reasons both supernatural and natural. And the Pope is the most important man in the world. I mean, if you don't know that, you don't understand the truth about reality. Like, the Pope matters more than the president. The Pope matters more than, at the time, the Soviet premier. And people forget about Khrushchev long before they forget about John Paul II. That's just the reality of the situation. The medieval popes mattered more than the Holy Roman emperors, who seemed like they were the greatest men on earth. And we remember the popes much more than we remember the Holy Roman emperors or the Byzantine emperors. The vast majority of Byzantine emperors are completely forgettable. That's the nature of the supremacy of the church over the states. So, okay. The church has this unique position in the world marked by the meetings of cultures and religions. According to the council, the church is increasingly aware of her mission, her duty, even her essential vocation to announce to the world the true salvation that is found only in Jesus Christ, God and man. Yes, only in Christ can men be saved. And then he quotes Acts 4. No one else can save, and under heaven no other name has been given to us that can save. But since the beginning of history, all are ordained to Christ, who is truly faithful to God's call to the extent that it is known to him. Sorry, I butchered the intonation. But since from the beginning of history, all are ordained to Christ, who is truly faithful to God's call to the extent that it is known to him, already participates in salvation accomplished by Christ. In other words, if you're already responding to Christ, you're already participating in what God is preparing for you in terms of salvation. Doesn't mean you're already saved right now, but you're on the path towards salvation. The church, aware of the common vocation of humanity and the only plan of salvation, feels united to each and every one, just as Christ united himself in a certain way to each man. And she proclaims to each and every one that Christ is the center of the created world and of history. Precisely because Christ is the center of everything in history and in the cosmos, and because no one goes to the Father except through him, we can address other religions with an attitude woven at the same time of sincere respect and fervent testimony of Christ in whom we believe. We well in them are the semini verbi, the seeds of the word, the rays of the only truth that the first fathers of the church spoke of, who lived and worked in the midst of paganism and to which the Second Vatican Council refers. In other words, you look at something like the work of Justin Martyr, and he talks about how pagans are already responding to the seeds of the word. And we want to do the same thing in a re-paganized world, while recognizing and proclaiming to these various religious groups that there's actually only salvation in Jesus Christ. We want to say these two things. Now, sometimes do we do a better job saying one of those than the other? For sure. In the execution of Assisi, did it sometimes come out in a way that looked indifferentist? Certainly, I think, in terms of the way it was carried out and the way it was reported, certainly in the news. But if you read what John Paul II said, I think the intentions were very good. I think the execution lagged, and there were some practical things that worked out very badly. For example, having the other world religions pray, not with us, but in churches, because we weren't going to do it with us. But then they're still praying in front of an altar to like false gods. That's not good. So those are just some of the logistical things that you could find a way of doing that where you don't have it in churches, where you have them praying in some other, like a conference room or something, where you recognize like this is not what we want to have happen here. So yeah, all that's to say, I don't know if I would go or not, but those are some thoughts about it. I think Assisi actually was bad in some regards, but I think people also exaggerate its badness. And if you read the things John Paul II was saying about it, they're surprisingly beautiful and are making the kind of distinctions that people complain that weren't made. They were sometimes. All right. Liam says, how do I disagree with other Catholics who feel strongly about an issue the church has no definitive teaching on? For example, a random Catholic influencer calling a random combat sport disgusting. Well, hopefully I just did that a little bit ago with the MMA conversation. I don't know what the backstory is. I've missed this round of internet drama. You can just say, I don't find it disgusting. We don't have to agree on everything, right? There are some of those things where, I mean, I think you should listen to why would people be disgusted by it? But sometimes people are grossed out more by the idea of the thing. And your reason for liking it is not their reason for disliking it. All right. Candle of the Night says, can you talk about the sibling oracles? The second references Mary's intercession, but it's about prophecy. Clement of Rome, Justin the Martyr, Josephus, and Saint Origin. Saint Origin? What are we doing here? Quoted / reference it. Okay. My knowledge of sibling oracles is weak. My knowledge of it, if memory serves, is that there is this blend. Some of them are Jewish, some of them are Gnostic, some of them are Christian in origin. And so what we mean by the Sibyls or the Sibylline oracles, like, it is a weird collection of writings. And they're going to be of varying quality. And I think many of them are clearly written after the things allegedly being prophesied. So there may be church fathers who believed they were authentic prophecies and they weren't. There may also be ones that are actual prophecies mixed in there. There is a weird collection, but I don't know a ton about it. And our knowledge about it, if memory serves, is all super late, like in terms of what we have in terms of surviving texts. So there's a lot that we don't actually know about it today. So there's always a chance that, like, they just had a better knowledge of the nuances between the good and the bad prophecies and the real ones and the fake ones, and we just don't have those distinctions today. Or maybe there's more that other people know that I just don't know. I mean, let's just leave a wide possibility that there's just more to the sibling oracles than I've ever known about because I haven't taken a close enough look at them. All right. I think, hang on, let me see something real quick. Yes, the sibling oracles have a Catholic Encyclopedia page, which is not a guarantee, but can be helpful. All right. In pagan times, the oracles and predictions described as Sibyls were carefully collected and jealously guarded in the temple of Jupiter Capitolinus and were consulted only in times of grave crises. Because of the vogue enjoyed by these heathen oracles and because of the influence which they had in shaping the religious views of the period, the Hellenistic Jews in Alexandria during the 2nd century BC composed verses in the same form, attributing them to the Sibyls, and circulated them among the pagans as a means of diffusing Judaistic doctrines and teaching. This custom was continued down into Christian times and was borrowed by some Christians, so that in the 2nd or 3rd century, a new class of oracles emanating from Christian sources came into being. Hence, the Sibylline oracles can be classed as pagan, Jewish, or Christian. In many cases, however, the Christians merely revised or interpolated the Jewish documents, and thus we have two classes of Christian oracles, those adopted from Jewish sources and those written entirely by Christians. So, all that is to say, as evidence, I don't think they're very good evidence, but maybe there's more distinctions I don't know about. All right. Number one, coolest says, WHO, World Health Organization, says the vegan diet is safe for all. Catechism of the Catholic Church, prayer 2418, says needless deaths of animals are bad. Should we be vegan because eating meat isn't a need? No. I mean, 2417 says God entrusted animals to the stewardship of those who he created in his own image. Hence, it is legitimate to use animals for food and clothing. The fact that you literally could find another solution doesn't mean that you are required to, particularly if vegan options are more expensive and harder ways of meeting your nutritional needs and so on. It's something that if an individual feels called to, that's fine and good. Um, but don't try to make a universal moral standard of it. A great way of seeing that is that Christ is not a vegan. I remember, as I used to be, this is going to surprise people. I was a vegetarian for like 6 or 7 years, and it actually was terrible for my diet. It was terrible for my diet for reasons that were completely avoidable. I just didn't know much about health, and I didn't have good discipline around eating like fruits and vegetables. So I would just eat a lot of like starches and things that were not particularly high in terms of satiety. So I started eating more and more. So I put on a bunch of weight, and it was just not good. And my reasons were a complicated mix of moral reasons and a girl. We'll leave all that aside. I firmly believe somebody can be a vegan if they're disciplined, and certainly if you have the economic means to eat good, healthy, clean food, and that's wonderful. But there are certain moral and spiritual traps to fall into very easily. One of them is to demand everyone do that, where Scripture is very clear. For example, one of the most beautiful, touching lines in the entire New Testament is in Acts chapter 10. St. Peter has this incredible vision of different animals coming down on a picnic blanket that I think just says a blanket, but I imagine a picnic blanket. In it were all kinds of animals and reptiles and birds of the air, and then a voice came to him, "Rise, Peter, kill and eat." Vegans are horrified. I kid, but clearly, Christianity is not a vegan religion. And I remember reading during my vegetarian days a Christian defense of vegetarianism. I think it was even written by like some liberal Catholic priest. And it said, yeah, sure, Jesus ate meat during his life. It's very clear from scripture. This was a suboptimal moral choice. And I was just like, oh, no, 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 no. We don't say Jesus made suboptimal moral choices. Like we're better than Jesus. You're out of your mind if you think that. So if you feel called not to eat meat, don't eat meat, but don't impose that on others or imagine that it's some kind of universal moral expectation. Speaking of that, Winston says, it's a tragedy for my wallet that fish has become more expensive than meat for Fishy Friday. I'm sure the biblical authors couldn't have imagined. You can often get like a cheap fish, but yeah, seafood is regularly expensive. It's true. I mean, you don't have to eat fish on Friday. You can have peanut butter and you can have cheese and you can have things that still meet your dietary needs that are not meat and are also typically not super expensive. Yeah, somebody else pointed out lentil soup with potatoes and tomatoes. Exactly. Now Joe wants a BLT. I have not. Yeah, I had a very small. I had a coffee and I shared a little bit of a muffin with my children. So I should have eaten lunch before this. The rest of this is going to be just food, and then I'm going to jump off the. I'm just kidding. All right. Rafa says there are lots of people in traditional circles criticizing Saint Faustina, her diary, and Chaplet of Divine Mercy. Are you aware of the critique? Can you address some of the points? I've seen varying qualities with the critiques. Some of the critiques are just like, oh, Divine Mercy Sunday is where Low Sunday in the octave of Easter was, and it's a shame to disrupt the octave. Okay, whatever. Like you've got different liturgical preference. I'm going to go with the church on this, but fine. Others say that she's promoting something too universalistic and all of this. I would say this, like with a visionary, when you scrutinize the vision, just remember that it's not scripture and not treated by the church as scripture. So even when it has the approval of the church, it's fine to just say like, I don't get what this part's about. And there is a role the visionary has in interpreting what they are seeing and hearing. And you can chalk it up to, I don't know if I'm getting this. I don't know if they communicated this as well as they could have and all that. So don't let it get in the way of your spiritual life. I like Divine Mercy Chaplet. We got married at the Divine Mercy Shrine here in Kansas City. And I'm nevertheless aware, like some of Faustina's diary is confusing, and it's like, what does this part mean? And that's fine. You don't have to make sense of it. One thing I would say, the traditional view is that canonizations are infallible, and that we should recognize that as a good argument against certain traditionalist critiques. Like if you take the traditional view and say, okay, well, if you're right, then Paul VI isn't a saint, John Paul II isn't a saint, Faustina is not a saint, and yet we have a pretty high degree of authority that this is known infallibly to be the case, that they are saints. I know traditionalists will often speak in a kind of pejorative way of like, oh, canonizing the council. And it's like, that's fine. If your concern about Vatican II is rooted in part in the idea that it's a pastoral council that doesn't have enough anathemas and speak at a high enough level of authority, so it seems too mushy, then when the church uses a higher level of authority to say, no, the people implementing these were good and holy people, and your attacks on them are attacks on good and holy people, I think we should listen to that. It doesn't mean there are no legitimate critiques of Vatican II. It doesn't mean anything like that. But it does mean that if the way you've placed yourself spiritually based on the decisions you've made and the things you've chosen to fill your mind with and all that, put you at odds with St. Faustina, St. John Paul II, St. Paul VI, and so on, I think that is a good reason to revisit your assumption if you're fighting against the saints of the modern age. That leaves a lot of room to say, like, yeah, but maybe we can still have more liturgical tradition and all that. I'm not going to the opposite extreme, but I'm literally just saying there's a reason you'll find some trads who will start to downplay modern canonizations and their infallibility. And I think that those arguments aren't very sound. Speaking of JP2 and Assisi, so I mentioned that earlier, the Catholic Polis said, do you have an Assisi videos in the JP2 Assisi? I don't. It's not the kind of thing, I usually don't cover purported scandals in the church unless there's like a tie into some kind of doctrine or principle. I can see a doctrine and principle being connected there with something like in a religious dialogue. The other thing is, like, I was 1 when that happened. And so a lot of this, I don't know. I mean, I don't know how much it's worth getting super into the weeds on it. I think there's sort of a vibe around a CC86, and then you get into the weeds and you're like, it's not, some of those things are true, some of them are not. This is a quick one, so I'm going to jump it ahead. Joseph says, are the Melkite formerly Orthodox? Is the 73-book canon of Trent meant to be maximally read or minimalist? Orthodox have Third Maccabees and First Esdras too. It is complete. It was a full and complete canon and was affirmed as such by the First Vatican Council. There are neither more nor fewer books. So it is both minimal and maximal in that sense. All right. Oh, Vivi Corey said specification. He was raised in an anti-Catholic court. Vivi, I'm sorry to just begin to your question here. That is helpful. He finds my faith beautiful, but he can't step foot in a church due to brainwashing. Might change over time, but it won't be easy. We also both physically can't have children. Okay. So some of the things I was worried about aren't applicable. Okay. Those are actually legitimate things to sort of work through. And if he's on board with working through them, if he finds it beautiful, then you might say under those terms, you can go to a priest and probably get it. Well, there's a decent chance you'd be able to get a dispensation from the bishop. I think what you would shoot for there is to see if a priest could marry you outside the physical space of a church, and then just have a very simple wedding liturgy while he continues to work on his own fears and issues with that. All right. Kendall and I had another sibling oracle question, but the same one, and I apologize for just getting to it. Daniel says, when a Protestant brings up the cadaver synod, how should a faithful Catholic respond? I mean, what is the argument with the cadaver synod? I mean, it's okay. There's a kind of Protestant argument that's just like, this Catholic thing is weird, therefore Catholicism bad. And it's like, guys, make an actual rational argument. There are plenty of things that look weird or bad. So the cadaver synod, for those who don't know, it was unseemly. A pope had his predecessor dug up and put him on trial. I would say in absentia, but he was sort of there, sort of, and condemned him for various things and had his fingers of blessing chopped off and all this. It's a good reminder of why. I think the takeaway is this: Catholics love to tear each other down. And one of the reasons I don't think that's a good idea is because frequently that'll be the only thing that is remembered. The merits of who is right and who is wrong won't be remembered. The infighting will be remembered. And I think the Cadaver Synod is a great example of that, because ask people who mentioned the Cadaver Synod, what were the two sides actually fighting about? Who was right, who was wrong? Almost nobody knows any of the history of that. They just know this crazy thing happened, that a pope dug up his predecessor and yelled at him and put him on trial and all this, which is like, it's crazy. It's memorable. You get why it sticks in the mind. It doesn't disprove any Catholic claim. Like, I would just say that is an unseemly way to carry yourself as pope, even if your predecessor did bad things. And there's a reason that is not the norm. And if your standard for Catholic popes is that they never do bad things or unseemly things or behave in foolish ways, you'll find plenty of things you can complain about and critique. But I hope that isn't your standard, because it's not a Christian standard, and it's not the standard we're called to figure out what the church is. So what are we hoping to get out of the Cadaver Synod that'll lead us any closer to the truth? And oftentimes you'll get some stupid answer like, well, I just don't think the true church would ever behave that way. Okay, would the true church be headed by a guy who denied Jesus 3 times? Or, would the true apostles have fled? What are you talking about? Like, go by theology, not by vibes. And a lot of the arguments that this kind of lowbrow Protestant argument just goes away. Like, yeah, it was a stupid thing to do. Next, what's left? All right. Vexed Oracle. Oh, we could have used you for the sibling conversation. Says, on piracy, if I own something, giving the creator their due, then use it from a pirate source for convenience. Is there any moral issue? I don't think so. I do that sometimes. If I have something like, frequently I'll have like a physical copy of a book, but then I want to quote it in an episode. And rather than transcribing it by hand, I'll just like find an ebook or something available online. And I'm not using it in a way contrary to what the creator wants. And I could physically, like, all I'm doing is making it easier to copy. I could also, these days, just photograph the page, put it in something and pull the text and all of that. But this is simply a slightly easier way of doing that doesn't hurt anybody at all. And so it's it's hard to see that as not even just like justifiable theft or something. It's just literally nothing has been stolen from anybody in any meaningful sense of that term. It'd be like cutting across the lawn while you're getting somewhere and calling that home invasion. Like, you've just expanded the definition to an absurd kind of limit. Mike said, and he sent a gift with a hippo spinning in an office chair. And I have no idea, none whatsoever, what that means. And I am fascinated by it. Vanessa, if you've got any insight, please let me know. Aaron says, thank you so much with all your help in my conversion. God bless you, Aaron. Congrats and welcome home. VFHFHCC says, do you feel many atheists and some Protestant arguments in the origin of the church imply/rely on ancient peoples being ignorant and credulous? Oh, tremendously. Oh, it's a super sticker. I didn't even know that existed. Thank you for the super sticker. I was so confused. Sorry, to the other question, but people being ignorant and credulous besides me. Yes, there is often this idea. I see this in Protestant apologetics where people claim like that the papacy started sometime in the 100s and people in the 100s didn't know that. So the most ridiculous versions are like, oh yeah, the papacy started in like 150. And then you've got these sources like Hegesippus in 160 and then Irenaeus in 180 talking about the apostolic origins of the bishop in Rome. And it's like, oh yeah, they were actually only like 10 to 30 years old at that point. It's like, seriously? So you were able to trick that many people into thinking that this was 200 years old when it was like 30 years old? And the people in Rome didn't know that? The people who grew up and presumably knew the first bishop didn't know he was the first bishop? They went through this whole period in their lifetime where they like didn't have a bishop and then did, and somebody just like made them forget that and they thought they'd always had a bishop. It's insanely stupid when you lay it all out, to put it bluntly, because you can understand like a traveler not knowing. Irenaeus lived in Rome for part of his journey, and he certainly knew the Christians of Rome. There's something just absurd about those kind of arguments. Similarly, with atheistic arguments, a lot of them just assume people will believe any miracle story or they'll believe any of these things. And you can find plenty of credulous people later on. I can't remember who it is. I think it might have been Chesterton, who pointed out that you don't actually have people at the time of Christ seeming that credulous. Like if you read the New Testament, they don't immediately rush to just assume everything is supernatural and everything, or that everyone who purports to be the Messiah is. They're pretty skeptical of a lot of this stuff. And you don't even see them doing a bunch of miracles. It isn't like you see Jesus performing miracles over here and then like his rivals performing miracles over there. Miracles are not a major part of Roman life at the time of Christ. And they're not a major part of Jewish life at the time of Christ. You have prophets, but you don't see a bunch of miracle workers. You see, the closest you get are exorcists. But you don't have a ton of wonder workers in like the first century data. A lot of that comes actually later because of Christianity. Because if these signs and wonders are real, then that has automatically changed my prior assumptions. If I don't believe in any miracles and somebody tells me about a miracle, I'm going to be very dubious or dismiss it out of hand. If I accept the miracles of Jesus and the miracles of the apostles, then I have to at least give a little bit of a hearing to somebody else claiming to have a miracle. So, all right. I'm jumping this one up too because I think it's funny. Joe, which is this Shredder? So I feel like you're biased in this question. Joe, which is more appropriate to be a fan of as a faithfully practicing Catholic, pirates or ninjas? Also, thanks for the great content. Thanks for training. Or well, I guess you opposed the turtles. Nobody don't like ninjas. It's man. I don't know if are you familiar with the Great Illustrated Classics series of children's books? They take classic literature and turn it into like 100, 120 page books that every other page is a picture. And they put it in somewhat easier English and all of this. I'm going through them with my kids now. We just did our first one. We did Kidnapped. I picked it up at the bookstore in Steubenville, actually, when I was there recently. And the kids loved it. But it really exposed how terrible being on a pirate ship would have actually been, because one of the kids is kidnapped and he's being sent off to be enslaved. And they're just like, they're horrible guys. The ninjas try to live by a code. And so they do things that, yeah, I'd go with ninjas. Bushido and all of that. I know samurai aren't the same as ninjas, and I know ninjas aren't as honorable as samurai. And you get the whole question of Ronin, but nevertheless, much more of an honor-driven culture. I think that's a better place to go. Craig says, what is the best response to my non-Christian and Protestant friends who attack my Catholic faith because of the sexual abuse in the church? They think I support an institution covering up pedophilia. I would say this. You can put those things in context, but it will come at a cost. You can point out, for example, that there is abundant evidence that other institutions were as bad or worse than the Catholic Church when it came to the abuse of children. Public schools, for example, seem to have had a much higher rate of sexual abuse of kids, and also similar levels of institutional cover-up. The little bit of information that we have today suggests that Protestants seem to have had comparable rates, in some cases maybe worse rates, of abuse and cover-up. they often don't make the headlines, partly because they're not a global force like the Catholic Church is. If First Baptist in small town Missouri has a scandal, no one outside of small town Missouri cares about that. But if the Catholic Church in that town has a scandal, that is international news, because the Catholic Church is a force to be reckoned with around the world and is, in fact, the major restrainer against the forces of evil. So the people who hate the Catholic Church want to seize on all those things. That doesn't mean those critiques are bad. We should recognize why they're being amplified. They're not being amplified because they are worse, or like in terms of number and all of that, when you compare it to either of those. So you can make all those points. And in some cases you should, if the person actually thinks the Catholic Church is uniquely bad on the abuse of children. So if that is what they think, and you can ask them that, well, is it your belief that the church is uniquely bad in this regard, or simply that we should not have anything to do with any institution that covers up pedophilia? I mean, the U.S. Army was systematically supporting pedophilia in Afghanistan. Nobody wants to talk about that, but we were allied with a bunch of pedophilic warlords in the Northern Alliance and all of this, and we were purposely not sharing information about this or doing much to police it. And then you have like Epstein and all that is to say, if you think that this is a uniquely Catholic problem, you are not paying attention. That is one angle you can go. What's the problem with going that angle? Well, the problem is people hear that and emotionally they feel like you're saying pedophilia doesn't matter. Abuse is not that big of a deal. Now, hopefully you're not saying that, but it can come out that way, or it can be received that way, I should say. I think it's an unfair interpretation, but it is an interpretation to watch out for. So I think it is worth saying the abuse of children is abominable. It is abhorrent. And in this, a remarkable thing emerges. When these things happened by the hands of Catholic clergy, when they were covered up by other Catholic clergy, the problem was not that they were so Catholic that they were covering up abuse or committing abuse. The problem was that they were not Catholic enough. In other words, if I've got a problem with like a jihadi committing violence in the name of Islam, I have a problem with his excessive interpretation of his religion, maybe with religion itself. But with something like the abuse of children, if they were more Catholic in their behavior, they would not abuse children, right? Like that is just simply how it works. So here, the problem wasn't that they were excessively Catholic. It was that they were not Catholic enough. And the problem the whole world faces is that we're not Catholic enough. I'm not as Catholic as I should be. You're not as Catholic as you should be. Certainly, your non-Catholic friends criticizing the Catholic Church are not as Catholic as they should be. So the remedy is the same. We should become more like Christ, and thus we should become more Catholic. That's not a trick. That's just simply, if the bishops were more configured to Christ, if they were more Christ-like, there would be less of an abuse scandal. If the priests who did these things were more Christ-like, there wouldn't be an abuse scandal in the first place. I like what Victor said. This is exactly how you know that you're in the real body of Christ. What happens in Germany affects me in Orlando, Florida. Right? Like that's how it works. We're part of a global body, and so we feel the pains of things going on in the whole body. And as a result, it can feel like the body is uniquely evil. It's just big. And it has real problems. And we can feel the weight of a billion people's real problems. Okay. I should wrap up pretty soon. Let's see. There's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 questions left. Those bottom 3 there, I already got 2. Okay, I'm going to take a couple of the quick ones here, and then everybody else might have to have you wait. I'm sorry about that. Mr. Piglets Cooks says, hello, what do you think about Hague Sancta? I think Hague Sancta is not an actual decree of an ecumenical council. I talk about this in one of my response videos to Redeem Zoomer. It was not at that point called by a valid pope. It had no authority. It was not accepted in toto by the church. It's kind of a complicated story, but that's the short answer. Eventually, the Council of Constance is convened by the real pope, but it had been originally called by an anti-pope who gets deposed. Complicated. Craig has a follow-up to the earlier conversation. Says, to play devil's advocate, couldn't one argue that sex abuse cover-ups show that the episcopal hierarchy of the Catholic Church is prone to more corruption versus decentralized Protestantism? It could if there was actual data saying Catholics had higher rates of abuse, but we don't see that. Every system has systemic limitations and structural failings. So every system you can imagine, from anarchy to tyranny, Congregationalism, Presbyterianism, Catholicism, whatever, you name it, every system has some point in the system where you say, this person might do a bad thing and get away with it. Even if you have total lawlessness, the guy who's the most powerful in the anarchic situation might be able to get away with stuff, and nobody can stop him because he's the biggest and the strongest, right? Or the mob might have like evil intentions and nobody can stop the mob because they're the biggest. Whatever it is, there's always going to be some point that you hit in every system where somebody has power and there's nobody above them to check that and they can get away with it. And if you put the mob above that, you put the people above that, like in a democracy, sometimes the people want evil things. Look at democracy in the US. Look at Jim Crow. Look at all the lynch mobs. Who is going to stop the lynch mobs? Oh, you arrest them and then they're tried by a jury of their peers and found not guilty? You found your systemic limitation. Every single system has this. It is inescapable. So the systemic limitation in a hierarchical institution is that people will misuse their authority. The systemic limitation in a decentralized system is that there's no accountability in the first place, that you're not having higher ups cover up the abuse, but the abuse happens and there's nobody to report it to. And this is what we find. And so back when the abuse scandal broke in the early 2000s, there was an insurance carrier who said they were finding higher rates of abuse within Protestantism than in Catholicism. That's one source, but they had a bunch of clients. And so they said, we have reason to believe that there are more cases per capita within Protestantism than within Catholicism. So that's what I would going to point out there. Okay. Mike says, hey, Joe, it seems many are leaving Protestant denominations and giving home to the Catholic Church. Thoughts? I think it's beautiful and good. I think people are beginning to see problems within Protestantism that maybe they'd never noticed. This is one of the benefits of the internet. And I think that our posture should be one of humility and not triumphalism, because we could easily turn this into a fad if we're just huge jerks and nobody wants to become Catholic. How we carry ourselves when God is favoring us will have a huge influence on whether he continues to do so and whether people will continue to respond. Okay. Let's see. Whiskey Actual TV says, for someone who is struggling with denominations, I feel like you have to have a theology degree to understand and join the correct one. No, that's the beauty, is you don't. Jesus comes into the world. He is the savior of the world. He promises he will build a church. The church he builds is visible and it is structured. It's visible like it's on a hill, and it's structured like a city. So he calls it a city on a hill. He is very clear. This church has both good and wicked men in it. Some of them are going to go to hell. In Matthew 13, he compares it to a net containing good and bad fish. So all this is super clear. He even says it's like a mustard seed that's going to grow into a mustard tree. The mustard tree is the largest of all the plants of the garden. So look for the biggest institution you can find on earth that is a visible, structured church that purports to be founded by Jesus Christ and can be traced credibly back to the time of Christ. And you've got your church. You don't need a theology degree to know that's the Catholic Church. To question those very simple realities, you would need a good level of theology. When people say, oh, well, the Catholic Church isn't the real church because it gets this obscure doctrine wrong, the filioque. Now you're having to do really deep theology to overcome the really basic thing Jesus made easy for everyone to find. But Jesus prayed that we would all be one. And Jesus said in John 10, he came so there could be one flock with one shepherd. And he gives this special role to St. Peter, where he gives him the keys of the kingdom of heaven. It says, whatever he binds on earth will be bound in heaven, whatever he looses on earth will be loosed in heaven. And promises the gates of hell won't overcome the church. And then in John 21, he entrusts the care of the whole flock to Peter. So there's someone in a Peter type role. It's not hard to find this church. It's not. We overcomplicate it, but it's actually very easy. Okay. Speaking of which, Noble Matthews, and then I think this will be the last question, and then I'll go through afterwards, Vanessa, to make sure I know I skipped around a little bit on this. Says, why does Irenaeus say that the preeminent authority of the church in Rome comes from its origin of Peter and Paul? Shouldn't Peter be sufficient for the authority if he truly does have supremacy? He doesn't say that. He says that the church was built by Peter and Paul, which is true. He says that if we want to know what to believe, this is in 180, by the way, and this actually answers in part the prior question. In order to answer heretics and answer those who are assembling in unauthorized meetings, notice that even here, you don't just form your own church because you think you've read the Bible correctly. You need authorization. And that we can answer such men by indicating what tradition derived from the apostles, the very great, the very ancient and universally known church, founded and organized at Rome by the two most glorious apostles, Peter and Paul. So the issue here is not that Peter was incapable of founding the church of Rome by himself. Paul's actually very clear in his own writings that someone has gotten there before him. We would say it's Peter. Originally, Peter gets there through the preaching at Pentecost, and eventually he goes there personally to build up the church there. So it is just a matter of fact that both Peter and Paul die in Rome, both Peter and Paul preach in Rome, both Peter and Paul build up the church in Rome. Nobody's saying this means Peter wasn't enough. I mean, we regularly see Peter acting in his individual role, but then other times he acts in concert with other apostles. The one doesn't contradict the other. Like if you and your spouse decide on something for the good of the family, that doesn't mean you were incapable of making the decision. It then says, by pointing out the faith preached to men, which comes down to our present times by means of the succession of the bishops, for it is a matter of necessity that every church should agree with this church on account of its preeminent authority. So he's very clear that Rome has a unique authority and that it is a matter of necessity that everyone agrees with the faith of the Church of Rome, which is still true. He does not say that this is because Peter and Paul together give it this preeminent authority. He simply says two things. Number one, the church is founded by Peter and Paul. Number two, it has preeminent authority. Those two things are both clearly true. All right. Everybody else, I will start off with your questions next time. And next time should be about 2 weeks from today. So I hope that helps. I hope that works. There's a good question in there about charismatic stuff. There's a good question in there about cuss words, oral Torah, and all this. So enjoy. If you haven't liked and subscribed and all that, please feel free to do so. All right. God bless you. Peace.